Hello everyone and welcome to our academic podcast. I'm Reina Raslan and I will be moderating today's discussion while also contributing to our analysis as we examine a central historical question. What are the lasting political, social, economic and cultural impacts of the French mandate on both Lebanon and Syria? The mandate emerged at the San Remo Conference in 1920, solidifying French control, and the region saw attempts at political formation before the League of Nations granted France the authority in 1923. This created a layered historical moment with both local aspirations and colonial governance, and which intersected often uneasily. The French continued to administer this area until 1946. And today we will unpack this legacy across four themes: the political structures, the social transformation, the economic policies, the cultural dynamics. I'm joined by Cesar Hamede and Ivan Saad, who will bring two contrasting interpretations to this discussion, and I will guide the dialogue while also offering contextual and comparative reflections of my own. Let's begin with our first theme, the political impacts, and the foundational question. Did the mandate create a functioning political institution, or were these structures largely symbolic under the French authority? To open the political theme, I want us to think about the institutional architecture the mandate introduced. So Cesar, could you start with your answer, please?
Yes, of course. So honestly, when we look at Lebanon at that time, the mandate did give us our first real political backbone. The French introduced the 1926 constitution, which set up the presidency, parliament, and the judiciary. Basically, the same structure we still rely on today. And sure, France kept control over major decisions, but the institutions they built weren't fake, they were functional. They created administrative routines, legal procedures, ministries, and the civil service that continued even after the independence. So even the creation of Greater Lebanon in 1920 gave the country defined borders and a sense of political identity for the first time. So whether we like the mandate or not, the foundations it laid were solid and long-lasting.
Okay, thank you so much. And it's worth noting that this is an important point about continuity. Many mandate-era practices still appear in today's governance, but continuity doesn't mean real independence. What truly shaped these institutions was how closely they were controlled by the French authority. So, Ivan, how do you assess this relationship?
Firstly, I want to answer. I have a comment on César's interpretation. He said that the French institution in Lebanon were functional. I want to say they only have a form. They were under a form. There was no national will regarding this institution. There was a lack of sovereignty since the French created government in Syria and Lebanon that had no actual political power. It was controlled by the French High Commissioner, who had the veto rule, where he had the biggest authority and could cancel any law that doesn't across with the French politics, which show us that these institutions and the government were controlled totally by the French, and there was an absence of national will, of nationalism and sovereignty.
Okay, thank you both so much for your contributions. So here we already see the tensions that institutions existed, but their sovereignty was conditional. So moving to our next subtopic, Lebanon and Syria. It concerns divergence. So my question is, how did Lebanon's political experience differ from Syria's under the mandate? Cesar, could you explain, explain?
Yeah, of course. So the difference is honestly huge. Lebanon got a much more stable experience. The French saw Lebanon, especially the Christian communities, as culturally closer to Europe, like even to this day. So they invested in its institutions instead of constantly reshaping them. With Greater Lebanon and the 1926 Constitution, Lebanese leaders had a steady political structure that carried straight into independence. Syria didn't get that. The French broke it into smaller statelets, suspended constitutions, dissolved parliaments. It was just chaos. Lebanon didn't go through that level of fragmentation, so while Syria's political path was disrupted at every turn, Lebanon had continuity, which shaped its political life in a more stable direction than Syria.
Okay, thank you. What stands out in Lebanon is that certain internal conditions seem to align with the mandate's administrative approach. Even without going into specifics, this broader interaction may help explain why its institutions develop a degree of continuity that we don't see everywhere else. So, Ivan, how does this differ through your perspectives?
Firstly, regarding Lebanon, during the French mandate, Lebanon was seen as a partnership with the Lebanese, with the French mandate, where the French had a great relation with the Maronite Christian that we will later look on. And regarding the other sectors and the Lebanese sectors, Muslims had different vision, but there was no a really anti-colonial movement. Only later on in 1932, where Antoun Saade created the Syrian National Party, but it remained as an ideology. We didn't see a anti-colonial movement revolts, whereas in Syria it has been divided into many states, but many states where every state had its own religion. The literal coast where we saw the Alawites, and on the other part Suwaida the Druze, whereas we saw a unity in Syria in 1925 20 to 23 when Sultan al-Atrash did a revolt, but it was oppressed by the French and didn't lead to a result.
Okay, thank you so much. So the very same mandate also introduced or produced administrative stabilization in one context and fragmentation in another, which is crucial in understanding how their about their post-independence trajectories. So moving into our third subtopic, which is the political culture, this also raises a bigger point to show how the mandate was affected in the way governance was understood and practiced. So how did it shape those norms and expectations? Cesar, could you please start?
Yeah, of course. I mean, definitely, it wasn't just about the institutions, it was about the mindset mostly. The French introduced a more modern administrative culture, proper record keeping, clear procedures, and a trained civil service. Lebanese officials learned how to run a state from inside that system. It pushed us away from the old Ottoman style patronage networks and towards something more structured and procedural. Even if sovereignty was limited, the political habits and culture Lebanon developed were heavily shaped during this period. And a lot of those administrative behaviors stayed long after the mandate even ended.
Okay, thank you. And this broader move towards more structured administrative practices is something many historians emphasize, and particularly when examining how governance developed in Lebanon over time. Ivan, do you have further?
Yes, regarding the mandate in Lebanon, the French realized a census, like a certain census, where it give every religion part a certain power in the state, even though the Maronite Christian had the biggest power, whereas in Syria it didn't divided it, and we still see till nowadays problems related to the absence of division in Syria, since we see many coup d'etat before, and then we saw a coup d'etat through the Assad regime that remained and fall down in 2024. Until nowadays, Syria does not have a stable political environment. Whereas in Lebanon, we saw a census. There is a certain conflicts, religious conflicts, whereas the institutions are better than Syria.
Thank you both. This mix of administrative development on one hand and tighter political control on the other really sets the stage for looking at the mandate's social effects. So, having looked at the political dimension, it makes sense to turn into the social impacts, and education is really the place to start. It was one of the mandate's most noticeable forms of social change. So, my question is, did the mandate era educational reforms benefit society broadly, or did they mainly reinforce existing inequalities? Cesar, could you speak on that?
Yeah, of course. I honestly think that they helped modernize society in a huge way, since the French expanded schools like lycées, missionary institutions, and brought in modern subjects like sciences, literature, foreign languages. So literacy went up, especially in Beirut, and education became a real pathway for families to move into the middle class. Also, a lot of people got opportunities in teaching, administration, and journalism that didn't even exist before. Was access perfectly equal everywhere? Of course not. But overall, the mandate pushed education forward and created a more educated society that could take part in modern life.
Okay, thank you so much. And those gains in literacy and professional life are significant, but they weren't universal. The real question is who had access to these opportunities because it varied quite a bit across population. So, Ivan, could you also speak on this?
Firstly, I want to mention that it is true that there was a modernizing society, but it it was for selected people, which were the Maronite Christian, since the institutions were established in Christian areas, precisely Maronite areas, but didn't reach into Muslim areas or Syrian interior. Which created an elite language and led to more inequalities. It created an elite language that then will have access to more jobs and will have more a better future. But however, these divisions increased and formed tension in the community instead of building an equal state. Usually the institutions are here to build an equal state in absence of inequalities.
Okay, thank you so much. And I would also like to ask a question to Cesar. How far did French schooling reshape class formation, and did it strengthen national identity or mostly sectarian groups?
I think that these schools helped create an entirely new middle class in Lebanon because suddenly you had lawyers, teachers, journalists, and administrators, like people who shared a common education and interacted in the same cultural space. We never had that before. In Lebanon, especially, this helped shape an early sense of Lebanese identity. People in urban areas started seeing themselves as part of a modern civic community, not just a religious or regional group. So, French schooling didn't just create those elites, it built a middle class that played a major role in forming identity and public life.
And that new middle class becomes influential later, as seen in journalism, law, and administration. Ivan, what would you like to add?
I want to add that the French school system actually made religious division worse. Instead of creating a shared national identity, it is the case since these schools became places where we found powerful religious-based political that grew up later when we can select and identify the Jmayil family, the Jmayil which studied at the USG university, which is a French institution, and helped him to access to a high ranking in the politics and acquiring a job in the government. But however, there is also another negative aspect is that every institution taught a different story about the Lebanese nation, which there was no common national story, which led of an absence of a nation a story of an identical nation, and there was no unity between the different people.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like also to tackle the issue of coexistence and competition. So, overall, did the mandate encourage coexistence between communities or did it intensify social and communal competition? Cesar, can you also elaborate on this?
Yeah, I think in many ways, yes, especially in the cities. Beirut became this mixed environment where communities actually interacted more than before. You had shared schools, cafes, cultural associations, newspapers. All of these public spaces brought Muslims, Christians, Jews, even Armenians together. A multi-sectarian middle class formed, and that helped create more shared civic spaces. So even though the mandate had policies that increased tension, urban life during that period also pushed communities closer together in meaningful ways.
Yes, and cities like Beirut did offer shared public spaces that brought various communities together, but still, we should keep in mind that these spaces were not equally accessible and participation varied across social and regional lines. Ivan, could you also speak on this?
The word coexistence differed between Lebanon and Syria. In Lebanon, in 1932, there was a census where it divided every every governor or politician power in the state, where the president was Maronite and the prime minister Sunnite and the head of parliament Shiite, which brought a coexistence of different religion, whereas it created tension that will later on be present as we in the civil war, for example. It will declench as an indirect factor of the civil war. Whereas regarding Syria, the land was divided in small statelets, small states where there was no like a census or constitution, which created chaos and made the authority for the most powerful leader, as we saw in many coups d'etat.
Yes, thank you. And this blend of increased interaction alongside growing inequality is central to understanding the social experience of this time. Our discussion of social impacts showed a mix of opportunity and inequality, interaction and division. The same tension appears when we look at economy as well. So that brings us to the next theme, economic impacts. So now turning to economics, were mandate infrastructure projects beneficial or mainly tools for French extraction? Cesar, could you speak on this?
Yeah, I mean, France definitely benefited, but the infrastructure they built transformed Lebanon in real ways. They upgraded Beirut's port, built better road networks, improved municipal planning, introduced modern communication systems, and all of that helped modernize the economy. These projects made trade easier, connected regions, and positioned Beirut as a major economic hub. And when the French left, the infrastructure didn't vanish. Lebanon used it to grow its post-independence economy. So even if the French had their own motives, it doesn't matter since the long-term outcome for Lebanon was pretty developmental.
Thank you so much. And yes, ports, roads, and other infrastructure did bring modernization, but we also need to think about the strategic goals behind them. That context really shapes how we interpret the long-term effects. So, Ivan, could you also speak on this?
The infrastructure reform, the infrastructure reform by the French were only for their own benefit. It was not for the local people. They were designed to quickly move French troops and military equipment to keep control of the Lebanese and Syrian territory. In addition, they used it economically to ship raw goods like tobacco to France, locking the Lebanese economy and serving the French market. In addition, they placed heavy taxes on local industries, and they placed heavy taxes on local industry and broke the trade links of the historical cities realizing this industry, Lebanese and Syrian cities. Even the port were expanded mostly up to help the French-controlled companies. So instead of building a balanced economy, this infrastructure was really just a tool for taking resources and keeping control of the French mandate.
Thank you both for your interpretations. And following that point, we can look at how infrastructure and financial reforms redirected economic activity. So my question is, how did port expansion, road networks, and banking reforms reshape economic centers in Lebanon and Syria? Cesar, could you speak on this?
I mean, they basically turned Beirut into the heart of everything. Once the French expanded the port and built road networks connecting Beirut to Tripoli, Saida, the Bekaa, and Syria, Damascus, the city became the main commercial gateway. And then at the banking reforms, the French introduced the new regulations, credit systems, foreign banks, and you get the foundation of why Lebanon became known later for its service and finance sectors. So really, the mandate development pushed Lebanon and even Syria into becoming the country's economic center.
Yes, and Beirut's rise is significant and notable, and it becomes a hub not regionally but also internationally. Ivan, how would you like to respond to that?
I would like to respond that the French economic policies shifted the center of commerce towards the coast, turning Beirut into the main hub, into the main economical, cultural, and political site. However, this led to inequalities, since cities like Aleppo and Damascus lost their historical role as a major trading centers. This led to breaking up the old regional trade network. In addition, the French implemented new taxes and increased the custom borders between Lebanon and Syria, which helped the French government. In addition, it led to the isolation of rural countries in the Bekaa and West and the Syrian front and the Lebanese front. However, it focused on only Beirut, and it favored the elites in Beirut that were approached to the French, and which created an imbalance between the Lebanese coast was prospered economically, whereas the Syrian and mountain and the Bekaa were left to stagnate.
Okay, thank you so much for your answers. And seeing how the mandate reoriented economic activity, the next issue is dependency. So the final economic question is, did all regions benefit equally from economic modernization, or did mandate policies deepen economic dependency and regional imbalance? Cesar, could you speak on this?
Yeah, I mean, not equally, no. Coastal cities like Beirut definitely gained more than rural regions. But even rural areas weren't totally left out. They got better road access and were more connected to national markets than before. And honestly, some of the imbalance wasn't just the mandates doing. The whole region was dealing with the post-World War I instability and economic challenges. So what matters is the mandate introduced the administrative and economic structures Lebanon later used starting point, even if it was uneven, like even if it wasn't fair to all the regions in the area.
Right, and that dependency doesn't fade after the mandate. It settles into the economic patterns we see in the decades that come. Ivan, could you also speak?
Yes, the French built an economic system of dependency. We were dependent of the French. They set up monopolies, take our profit, and weakened our local manufacturing, as you mentioned before, in the different region, Aleppo, in Syria, and the Bekaa Valley. In addition, they prospered coast area, whereas Syria was neglected. In addition, they implemented road and uh, high taxes on the cities, which made a worst case scenario. In addition, when Lebanon and Syria took their independence, here was the main problem, since Lebanon had a fragile service sector, whereas Syria had an underdeveloped agriculture sector mainly.
Exactly, and modernization is evident across all sectors, yet it carries with a structural vulnerability that comes embedded over time, influencing how the economy evolves afterwards. We've seen how the mandate transformed economic centers and created long-term dependencies. But its influence was not only material, it also shaped language, education, and cultural life. Let's tackle this final theme, cultural impacts. So the key question for this final theme is, to what extent did that cultural influence move beyond elite groups? Cesar, could you speak on that?
Yeah, of course. I think the French cultural influence really extended beyond the elites, since through schools, libraries, cafes, newspapers, and even theater, French cultural influence reached a big part of the middle class. People grew up reading French literature, studying in French, engaging with new ideas in journalism and the arts. It shaped the intellectual life of the country, not just a small elite group. So French culture became one of the layers of Lebanese society, especially in the urban centers.
Yes, thank you. And Francophone culture became a marker of status and modernity in certain circles. For certain segments of society, it tied it to modernity and prestige, and it shaped how certain groups positioned themselves socially and intellectually. Yvonne, what would you like to add?
I want to add that the French culture only reached a certain citizen of Lebanon and Syria, especially the Christian Maronite. And the Muslim countryside, it barely had any impact. Also, the French used culture as a tool for control, since they pushed their language over Arabic to censor any Arabic press paper, and to stop anti-colonialism idea spreading. Because of this, French culture felt forced, not really, because of this, French culture was forced and obliged to the citizenship, which created later on many different anti-colonial movement and calling for independence later on.
Yes, thank you. So, considering how uneven this cultural reach was, and given the dynamics, the next question is, why did Lebanon and Syria respond so differently to French cultural influence? Cesar?
Yeah, so Lebanon already had strong ties to France before the mandate, especially through Maronite missionary schools in the 19th century. So when the mandate expanded that system, it didn't feel like an attack on identity. It felt like an opportunity. Beirut was already cosmopolitan, open to different cultures, and French education gave access to international ideas, languages, and careers. So the cultural blend felt natural here, whereas in Syria it was tied more directly to feelings of occupation. It wasn't natural.
Yes, thank you. And there does seem to be a historical dynamic that helps explain these reactions. Even though it doesn't give us a single explanation, it holds a depth into how we understand them. So, Ivan, what's your view on this?
My view on this is the French cultural influence differ between Lebanon and Syria, since Lebanon was like a partner with the French mandate. It was accomplishing all the demanded from the French mandate, but also the French mandate gave them some line of authorities. Certainly in Beirut, as you mentioned, it prosperated Beirut, whereas in Syria, they were anti-colonial against the French mandate, and they realized many revolt. As we know, the King Faisal realized a revolt in 1920, whereas this revolt led to his loss. He lost the revolt and was exiled by the French. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. So, thinking about identity more broadly, it is worth asking how far these cultural policies went into shaping communities. Would you like to say, or would you say the mandate cultural policies ended up strengthening national identity or weakening it? And did they create hierarchies that still shape societies today? Cesar, what's your view on this?
For Lebanon, I'd say they strengthened it in certain ways. French schools introduced ideas like nationalism, civic life, and public debate, which helped people imagine Lebanon as its own nation, not just a part of a broader Arab or Ottoman world. It also created social mobility for people who mastered the language. Yes, it created a cultural hierarchy, Francophone versus non-Francophone, but it also opened doors and helped shape part of what became Lebanese identity. It added another layer to what being Lebanese meant.
Yes, and we can still see traces of those hierarchies now. They linger in how language functions socially, the social interactions, and even the political life across different communities. Yvonne, what would you respond to this point?
I want to respond that the French created many hierarchy, primarily the cultural hierarchy by putting the French language on top. It led to a privileged elite for the person who speak French, and the rest was second citizens. In addition, the system especially favored the Christian communities with better school and sidelined the Muslim, the Arabic languages, which created a rupture between the Muslims and the Christian, since they have different mentioning of the Lebanese identity and history, from the French. In addition, in Syria, we saw repression and anti-colonial movement against the French, which was not present in the Lebanese majoritarily, since it was majoritarily Maronite Christian. And that's it.
Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you, Cesar. And with that in mind, we can turn now into our final remarks. So, as we conclude, our discussion shows that the French mandate left a legacy that was complex and far from uniform. Politically, it introduced new institutions, but their independence varied widely. Socially, it expanded education and new professions, yet it also deepened existing inequalities. Economically, it brought modernization, but also created patterns of dependency that lasted long after independence. And finally, culturally, it offered new ideas while also provoking resistance and creating hierarchies that continue today. Overall, the mandate produced both change and constraint, progress in some areas and fragmentation in others, and its impact is still visible across Lebanon and Syria. Thank you, Cesar and Ivan, for your insights, and thank you for everyone listening. We hope this discussion contributes to a deeper understanding of how the mandate continues to shape Lebanon and Syria today.
Thank you, Irena, for hosting us on your podcast.
Thank you.